during during the webinar, feel free to ask them. I'll keep an eye on those as we're going along. So maybe we'll queue them up for the end, and Pete, I'll just run them by you as they come up. We will we'll also, we're covering essentially 10 things here. So as we go through each of them, if there's something in particular that you'd like for us to follow up on, please put them in as a question. With that, let's go ahead and get started with the webinar.
Sure. So I'd like to kind of start off with sort of a what's in it for me or with them slide to kind of set the stage of why is moving from FTC to CAM important. And from a business perspective and from a development perspective, there's kind of some obvious reasons, like reducing some of the declarative friction that everybody has to go through and frustration dealing with the full trust code model. And once you move from full trust code to the cloud app model or the app model, or now changing again to the add-in model, you start to be able to deliver things a little quicker, and we'll see a slide a little later about some of the penalties you pay, or kind of an estimation of the penalties you pay. And now moving away from full trust code, you start to be able to follow some things that will increase your solution quality and let you do some things that were rather difficult within SharePoint in the past. And the things that really kind of stand out to me are it enables you, moving from that full trust code server-side object model, enables you really to increase your value. You start to move into a kind of standard web development world that actually has an abundance of tools at your disposal and a lot of things that can benefit you as a developer and as someone trying to bring value to your business. And most of all, we kind of called in a previous seminar and SharePoint Saturday session last year, Sean Hester from ThreeWill called SharePoint a platypus, kind of this animal that through over time sort of had things bolted onto it, and sort of had a spur that could hurt you, had some webbed feet, and really looked strange if you looked at it from the wrong angle. And there is no more platypus. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, sort of why I think this is really good for you. There's some high-level things that make you more productive and are really valuable from a business perspective, how far and how fast you can move.
That's great.
So for kind of the typical 5 or 10 things, I kind of like to think of it as more of a David Letterman homage right now. With David Letterman leaving, I wanted to do kind of a top 10. So we're going to run through these, and I'll start with don't pay the customization tax. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to write declarative code, you're going to, over time, pay a tax for customizing anything that was deployed with that declarative code or using the feature framework. And that starts with learning to kind of code imperatively and use C#, CSOM, etc. to actually deploy your features, your customizations. So starting with something like a standard team site or a standard list, and then layering in your customizations is what you really want to do to kind of take advantage of this cloud app model. And the challenges with the FTC model or the full trust code model, if you're developing in C#, typically you're going to have to deal with, and this may be a strange phrase to someone relatively new to SharePoint, but ghosted and unghosted pages. So if I have something on disk, yeah, frightening. If I have a file on disk and I'm looking at a template that's based on disk, I don't have access to those anymore. So if I'm going to try to deploy those things and use templates the declarative way, sooner or later I'm going to have to write code to address that. And if anybody's been around SharePoint long enough, what you realize is maybe I did a list schema and deployed a list. But sooner or later, if I wanted to change that, I actually had to write code to address changing things that were provisioned with that list template. So that's one of the things that you don't want to pay that customization tax. You want to think of those things in advance. And along with that, there's things like the old model of running something in context within the server framework, you had DevOps and your IT department constantly coming to you saying, no, I'm not going to allow custom code on the server. So in some situations, in some customers, you weren't even allowed to do that. It was an isolated farm, or you couldn't even do it. When the sandbox solutions came out, that was, kind of, we have customers specifically who kind of do that, and it's a way around things, but there are limitations to it. And then you have the ALM, or application lifecycle challenges, as well. The ability to kind of version things easily, unit test things easily, deploy them easily, and not have to go through the pains of upgrading all the time. That's the things you want to move away from. And the cloud app model or add-in model allows you to do that. And it also, kind of broadens the scope. So it's not just SharePoint anymore, and we'll touch on that. The other big thing is the full trust code model is not future-proof. So to the extent that it can be, CAM is going to protect you from trying to future-proof an app from Microsoft kind of pulling a feature or obsolescing an API call, or working with some of that. It's not available in Office 365. They're never going to have full trust code in Office 365. They'll have Office, or they'll have full trust code on-prem. So 2016, SharePoint 2016's announcement, there'll still be the option to do that. But there are benefits to doing things even in the cloud app model, even if you're on-prem. Okay. So that's why I say think twice, even if you're on premises.
And this just a basic question, just define what is, when we're talking about, and I know it's the name of the webinar, full trust code versus CAM.
Okay.
Just at a high level, just for
so full trust code just assume that if I'm writing C# and I'm writing that code to run in context or on the SharePoint server itself, I require full trust for that code to run. There's many people who say things like, well, I can run with elevated privileges and all of these things, but nothing stops you from writing code that is a runaway process, basically. SharePoint, as a rule, required you to have some in-depth understanding, and that full trust code model on the server side required you to do things like understand what SP dispose really, what had to be disposed. So if I wrote a custom class and I consumed some of those web or site objects, I had to dispose of those properly, and sometimes that was not the most intuitive thing to do. When we say cloud application model, to me, it's a benefit on multiple fronts. I can now get a good clean separation of my code and some of the SharePoint code, cleaner, maybe not always clean, but I can start to move away from that running inside the SharePoint process. So I don't have to connect to WP anymore. I'm not connecting to debug in that situation. I'm also not running inside that context and having my IT department tell me, you just blew up the server. And your little web part that goes and queries Active Directory and tries to build this organizational structure on the fly, by the way, kills the server every time it runs, right? I mean, those are the kinds of things, a real world scenario that happened, that somebody said, shut it down. I'm not going to run that code. If I have a cloud application model, I start to get that, take that away. I can run these things out of process and just surface the information inside of SharePoint. So now I'm using SharePoint as kind of my viewable surface, if you will, and I'm surfacing the content, but it's running outside of process. And there are benefits and drawbacks to that. I'm not going to paint a rosy picture. I mean, they're good and bad. It's more good to me.
Is this something that came about with SharePoint 2013? When did the CAM stuff come about?
2013. So in 2010, there were ASMX services and the start of the client-side object model. 2013 really kind of stepped it up a notch and let you start to do things more and more. And now with 2013 and Office 365, some of the changes that are being pushed are monthly. So you'll see monthly updates to the client object model.
That's great. I appreciate you.
No, that's good. I kind of jumped in there.
Yep,
so.
Absolutely. No problem. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I wanted to show a little bit of something that we've showed some customers in the past, and I've showed in some other areas. This is a little fictitious. It's an estimation, but one of the reasons that SharePoint kind of grew so quickly is, if you look at the bottom there, a farm solution or a full trust code solution, you could go for quite a while with custom requirements and actually do things like prototype within the UI, create something very meaningful and very valuable, and you didn't pay a whole lot. You didn't pay a huge price for that too quickly. You got a lot of value. So, but once you started to hit this point of, trying to customize SharePoint and make it do some things that, it wasn't really designed to do, you started to really pay the price for that. So as you kind of increase your custom requirements, the level of effort required to do some of those things was astronomical and just not feasible. It wasn't valuable to a business a lot of times to do that, in my opinion. But what we see with a provider-hosted app is there is a learning curve, right? You're going to have to learn some new things. You're going to probably have to learn JavaScript if you don't already know it. And when I say learn JavaScript, I don't mean, kind of the old school JavaScript that everybody hates. There's better things and better ways to do that now. But once you get past that learning curve and once you learn some core concepts, that curve really gets shallow. And you reach this point where you start to pay less and less of a customization tax in that realm, in my opinion.
Okay.
And then once you get out past that kind of, the point where those two lines meet, you really start to see value in looking at a provider-hosted app from the perspective of how much does it take for me to do something that is custom. Like if my business wants a particular application that needs some sort of relational store that exceeds the capabilities of SharePoint, I can do that now, and I'm not trying to, square peg round hole the solution. I can actually say, well, I can surface this information inside of SharePoint, and it acts like SharePoint, looks like SharePoint, but the backing store is a SQL database or a document database or whatever it might need to be. So, I think from my perspective, paying that customization tax, you really need to consider that. And for me, this is a huge benefit of this new model. And as I said, it's not just for SharePoint. The second thing is think of, don't think of moving from full trust code to the app model or add-in model as I need to migrate again. Think of this really as a transformation of your code to live in a new world. And the definition down there at the bottom is it truly is a kind of a radical or dramatic change in the way you need to think. So when I say that, you've got to look at the business problem. Vesa Huvinen and Steve Walker always kind of say, reevaluate that business problem. So look at this as an opportunity to pay off some of that technical debt. And when I say technical debt, I mean, in the past, if you weren't unit testing something like a web part because you thought it was too difficult to do some sort of mocking strategy for that UI, now you have that opportunity to actually do things in sort of the MVC or MVVM model that lend themselves to kind of decoupling that code and writing for testability, teasing things apart for better deployments. If I'm surfacing information inside of SharePoint and I've done things appropriately, that's going to be easier. Yes, it is a rewrite, right? So you're probably not going to be able to just use your code. You're going to have to look for some opportunities to make some changes. The classic example is a timer job, right? So a lot of people have experience with writing timer jobs in SharePoint 2007, 2010. If you're going to write that in 2013, you really want to think about it. If you're on-prem, that may make sense. And I'm not going to lie, that may make sense to a lot of folks on premises. But if you're going to do that in the cloud, you don't have that option, right? You can't deploy that full trust code. So doing that in the cloud forces you to think about what is the business process really demand. Don't just throw a timer job at it because I can. Right now, if you wanted to do that, could you use a queuing mechanism? So could you queue those items for later processing? Could you use a web job that kind of looks as a standard task that's just running in the background? So yeah, it means some rewrite, but it's also a really good thing to start to decouple some of your software and get back to what I always say is, I think SharePoint, in my opinion, made a lot of software developers who are really quality software developers kind of lazy. They forgot some things because SharePoint just didn't let you do it. So this brings back some of those good practices, in my opinion. And there are assessment tools out there that will help you make this transformation, but they're only going to analyze your code. They're not going to look at the business process. They're not going to tell you, hey, this process really could be teased apart and done better if you analyze the process and said, you know what, I'm actually using a timer job, or I'm using some bit of code that's actually running with elevated privileges. Maybe you don't need to do that anymore, right? So it makes you kind of think, and it should make you think. It should make you kind of analyze that process and come to a different conclusion, hopefully. So transforming rather than migrating your code. And the way that Microsoft, the Patterns and Practices team is kind of pushing this is there's a transformation approach that really looks at understanding what's available to you. So gather an understanding, or kind of train yourself, train some folks around you, your organization, et cetera, in what the app model is, what CSOM is, things that you're going to have to use in transforming those solutions. And then look at your solution assessment and basically walk through that solution, analyze those requirements, look at the business requirement of the solution. Is it purely UI? Do they really need to have timer jobs? Can this be a workflow? Does that workflow need to be in code anymore? Can it be declarative completely? Take the opportunity to look at some of those things, and then plan out what that transformation is going to be. What do you need to do? Where are you going to host these applications? If you're on premises, how are you going to do that? Do you need to order the hardware? All those things need to be considered. And we're not talking about migrating just the 2010 environment to 2013 or 2013 into a different farm. I'm talking about, how do I tease apart that application? If you've got content there and a content type that you've deployed declaratively in the past, there are ways to basically create a new content type that is, quote, imperatively deployed, and then convert some of that the existing content to that new content type to enable you to kind of decouple that and not pay that customization tax we talked about before. And then finally, the development and testing and the deployment stages. That's once you start down that road and you get that plan, you're going to have to go through all of that technical planning, just what I just said. Do I have content that I have to migrate? Can I do greenfield migration? Do I have apps that I can just move over time? If you've got a significant investment in an app that was released last year, you're probably not going to rewrite that immediately, right? You're going to take that opportunity to kind of say, yes, I can do maybe greenfield opportunities. A lot of our clients today are doing that. They'll look at newer opportunities or greenfield projects to do this versus trying to redo all their apps immediately.
And I imagine a part of this approach is not just looking at the apps you've created, but also a lot of people on the on-premises implementations, they have a lot of third-party tools as well, right? I mean, because that we've heard from customers where if they're leveraging something pretty heavily inside of SharePoint that that is probably his full trust solution, then what do? They need to decouple that from that third-party option, and then they're looking. So it's probably also part of that analysis is looking at what are you currently using in your environment.
Yeah, I mean, think of web parts that are using audiences, right? If I'm using a custom web part that uses audiences and is targeting content, how do I do that in this new world? Maybe I have, just a JavaScript, a piece of JavaScript that's actually making AJAX calls to a custom web API and secured with AD groups. Those are things that, have a better solution today in my mind. You're not trying to look at some of those and say, oh, that's that square peg round hole issue that I kind of look at. And it's used to be hard. You used to have to kind of rack your brain and say, there's got to be an easier way, and in my opinion now there really is. So the third thing is gradually adopt. Just transform what makes sense as it makes sense. I mean, this is kind of really my opinion based on what some of our customers have done. And I mentioned before, if you're on premises and you're going to stay on premises, then server-side object model might make sense. But understand the risks when you do that. If for some reason 2016 has something that would break that code or make changes to how that has to be implemented, yes, you could write that code maybe faster today because you've got that knowledge of 8, 9, 10 years of SharePoint experience with server-side object model code. But do you really want to pay that customization tax?
Mm-hmm.
You know, do I want to code that again, or do I want to make some smart decisions now in a greenfield project, for example, and just do it with a cloud application model? So if I'm going to gradually adopt, I want to focus on that user and business requirement. You know, can it be something that is a minor change to an existing app? You're not going to change a full app, right? But if it's something that, you know, oh, I need mobile. Well, if you're going to use mobile, if you need some sort of mobile interface or responsive interface, take that opportunity to, let's deploy the site imperatively. Let's use CSOM to deploy that site. Let's, you know, we'll talk about a couple of other things in here, remote management or remote patterns. Deploy it remotely, and then use the things that are at your disposal, like HTML5 and responsive, and do the media queries that will let you kind of target different devices. And if you happen to separate your logic out, you can basically have an API behind the scenes that then could be a native application, an iOS or an Android app that's just using SharePoint as a series of services. And we'll talk about that too. So you really want to kind of think about, well, you know, just because I can, should I, right? You know, just because you can doesn't mean you should. You really want to gradually adopt these things and say, you know, okay, just because I can write that the server-side object model code, should I really be doing that? Yes, I might be able to do that a little faster, but I'm going to pay the price for that.
I wonder if, you know, as you're talking about gradually adopting, is there anything where we're seeing like people first start to move, let's take for instance, they start to move their extranet onto Office 365, but they keep their intranet on-premise, or how do you, I guess with part of this is trying to decide, yeah, I want to get my feet wet with starting to do some things in the cloud, but how do I distinguish, and we're sort of looking at a technology approach to distinguishing that, but are we seeing anything where we see people, you know, maybe deciding on one environment versus the other, and has there been a sort of a pattern that we're starting to see people?
If I had to describe it in sort of very quick terms, it's hybrid, right? So you mentioned the webinar that we did before and kind of a live event based on the white paper, and the reality is most organizations are going to be hybrid. It just doesn't make business sense not to use Office 365 for some of the you know, I'll call them commodity services. Some people don't like that term, but you know, Outlook, your email, tasks, you know, those things are great services that you know, the reality is they're running at such a massive scale, you can't beat them from a price perspective, right? But you know, you may have a huge investment in provisioning site collections for team sites or projects, or you know, those things are processes that are business specific. They might have things that are very specific to you. May have custom code, right? So the provisioning process is custom, but you know, that's something you probably want to selectively say, over time, I'll move that into the cloud. The other thing is search. Search is one of those huge high-value things for a lot of our customers, and you know, that story is getting better. It's a little hard today in certain situations to kind of have a synchronized, if you will, or a single search experience. It's doable. It's not great today if you're, you know, on 2013, but 2016 will let you have a common index. So I think the short answer is it's hybrid. So trying to gradually adopt means picking your battles and saying, okay, if we're going to move for calendaring and email and some of those things, you're going to put that in the cloud. But I'm going to stay on-prem for quite a while. Just look at how do I do the things I do today in a better way. So that if you have to do a rewrite, or if somebody asks for a feature for the team sites provisioning that you're doing today, think about how do I do that, and start to piecemeal, gradually put in those pieces. So you'll have an IIS server that's running maybe an IIS or an MVC app that's injecting some JavaScript into everything versus deploying those assets like you used to do using a feature. So take some opportunities to stop doing some of those things, and you don't have to do a wholesale process. Too many businesses that we talk to really think of it like, I got to make this huge investment and rewrite everything. No, you're going to have to rewrite them if you choose to, but you don't have to rewrite everything today. The fourth is own the provisioning process, and I just kind of mentioned that with hybrid. If a lot of companies are provisioning those sites and team sites, and even other project sites or groups or et cetera. There's where you really want to avoid the feature framework deployments. That's where you're going to get into the most trouble with deploying, an XML schema file for a list and net files. In certain situations, you can't do that, right? If you're going to do that to Office 365, it's just not even an option. But if you move away from that on premises, then you start to look at, how do I do this? And to your point earlier, Danny, look at doing things additively. So instead of deploying that JavaScript asset or trying to make some calls to user profile service or some of those types of things, don't put those in C# code and deploy them in an assembly and be server side. Think about how can I do that using CSOM in an IIS process that's removed from the SharePoint server in a different app. The reason, it doesn't even have to be IIS. It could be, Node and PHP. You're not restricted anymore. So if you've got Java skills and you can do this, now the world's kind of your oyster. If you've got JavaScript skills and Node and you're coming from a different world, you can do those things now too. You really need to learn to use remote provisioning patterns. And that's, it's a blessing and a curse, because I think some of this is, okay, now I'm off the server, but now I've got to figure out how to do things remotely. What CSOM is available to me? I know the server-side object model like the back of my hand. I got to learn some new things. I've been pretty impressed with how quickly some of the things that people fill out in user voice. So if you see something that's a gap, log a user voice call or a user voice request, a feature request, and let them know. Let the PMP team know. There's a lot of avenues to kind of make this story better. I think Microsoft's making some huge investments in there. But the bottom line is you have to learn some new skills or some new patterns and approaches to say, if I want to deploy and provision a consistent OneDrive experience for my users, right? So we chose to go to Office 365, but I want to automatically deploy that OneDrive. The Patterns and Practices team has a couple of examples where they're injecting some JavaScript on a page, and every time someone visits that page, if they don't have a My Site provision, they automatically provision that page. I mean, think of the power of some of that. So the user experience improves. They're not sitting around with, the spinning wheel of death, so to speak, waiting on I'll be done soon, type things. So those operations can be done in the background.
Working on it.
Yeah, working on it, right? And then, as I mentioned, the PMP, use that provisioning framework. So they just recently, the Patterns and Practice team just recently published an update to their GitHub repository in May, and I just find it amazing. I mean, so this is a big gap to us specifically internally for the way we provision our client and project sites. Being able to extract all the information from an existing site and kind of use that as a template was a missing piece. You had to write a whole lot of extra code. Now you have that benefit of being able to say, I want to configure a site sort of point and click, right? So I want to create a site, create some lists, create content types, my site columns, all of that through the UI, and then use their provisioning framework to actually consume that either live site or kind of take that live site and export it as a template. And I won't go too deep into there. I'll mention some links later. And use that template to provision new sites and then layer on your changes. So if you're going to provision a new site, basically say, I want custom forms, or I want the ability to kind of have drag and drop on some of my lists. We'll layer that in as sort of an app or a SharePoint app or even a remote app that lets you do that and gives that better user experience.
Now, this provisioning framework, you just mentioned sites, and you were mentioning OneDrive earlier. I'm used to the provisioning new sites from, understand that process. Is there other things that you're trying to provision as well, or what are some examples?
Yeah, we'll touch on that. Good segue.
Thank you.
So I'll give you a $5 bill later. So when I talked about remote provisioning, when I talked about remote provisioning patterns, one of those is you really need to understand what can you affect if you're in the cloud, what can you affect if you're on-prem. If you're in the cloud, you're going to have a tenant that you have to deal with. You're going to have site collections in both environments, webs, pages, etc. All the assets that you might deploy, JavaScript, web part definitions, etc. So some of those things, if you're on-prem, don't really change, right? You have all those same structures or entities that you're going to have to deal with. If you're in Office 365, though, you're going to have to walk some of those things. So you're actually going to have to iterate over some of those site collections to do some of those operations. If you have external sharing, for example, how are you going to find out today what all of your users that have external sharing turned on, or all of the custom sites that you've got provisioned? That's a gap. So you're going to have to iterate over those and do some reporting on your own. How you do that is very important. Remote management means I'm going to have to use a client-side object model, or I'm going to have to use REST. And there's some varied opinions here about which is better, which should I focus on, which should I prefer, etc. I find when we go to customers these days, a lot of times it's, I just want to get the job done. And if you're comfortable with REST and you understand it, I think you can get huge value out of that. That's probably the way I would go. There's some long-term benefits to that. That's provides you some added value and flexibility, but some things you just need to do with CSOM. So there's a trade-off there. You're going to have to learn a little bit about both. The other how is really, we talked about looking at your business problem again and not necessarily going with the old standard approach. Event receivers are a great example. You do have the ability to use remote event receivers, but remote event receivers are not guaranteed. In my opinion, in my experience, they're doable. You can code them, but if you need something that is, quote, and I'm doing air quotes here, transactional, and you want to be guaranteed, you've got to think of some other ways to do that. So looking at things like change logs and search queries and finding out other ways of ensuring that if I need to know and I need to guarantee that I can process the fact that list item X changed, I may want to look at how do I use the change logs, query those change logs, persist those changes somewhere else, and then operate on all those changes. So redesigning some of your business solutions, you're definitely going to have to do that. You're going to have to learn some of those things of how do I do this, and I may have to iterate all these things. I may have to cache some of this information. Do you really want to be walking every site collection to find all those external users and all those external sharing instances? Probably not. You're probably going to want to persist some of that information as far as site collections and site collection owners and all those types of things somewhere else. Maybe a SharePoint list, maybe a SQL database in Azure. Those are things you're going to have to kind of look at, how do I do it? Okay. Which leads me to that last thing, which is Tim Dotai. There's more than one way to do this. So if I have to do things remotely, I can do them with PowerShell. I can do them with web jobs in C# or Python. It doesn't really matter. I mean, Azure really opens up the door here for you to do some really new things. But if you've got people with different skill sets, now they can kind of play along in this space.
I am glad you pronounced that acronym that way.
I won't go there. You can pronounce it however you wish.
I didn't. I'm showing restraint. That's the sound of restraint right now. Okay.
So number 6 is
understanding cloud patterns.
So the 6 is understanding cloud patterns, and there'll be some argument over this. I'm sure some people have some very strong opinions in this, and we came out last year and sort of said it doesn't. The question isn't, are you going to write a provider-hosted app or a SharePoint-hosted app, etc. The question is, where are you going to host your provider-hosted app? That's just something that I think you have to think about. Even on-prem, you have to start thinking, where am I going to do these things? If I'm going to have remote management, where am I going to put this? Am I going to put it in a console app? If I'm going to put it in, maybe I have some folks with strong Linux backgrounds and they know Apache servers like the back of their hand. Maybe I can write those services on Linux and consume them from Linux. Or, if somebody knows Node, there's no reason not to write them in Node now. The other thing is you've really got to understand and kind of use the standards and flexibility that the newer JavaScript frameworks give you, HTML5 and CSS, and all those things at your disposal to say, how do I provide my customers the experience they're looking for, whether that's mobile, whether that's reporting, whether that's fast UI. I hate that term, but that's how customers kind of speak sometimes. It's just got to be fast. Okay. Well, take advantage of some of those things. The big thing with cloud patterns, though, I think, it's going to sound funny and it's going to sound strange, but if you have never looked at the OAuth 2 spec, do yourself a favor and look at it. And it's the most boring read you'll ever have, but I swear it'll be worth your time. Microsoft's doing a really good job at providing ADAL or Active Directory authentication libraries for almost every platform under the sun. And if they're not platform specific, then they're providing the ability to make calls, using just standard REST calls. Mm-hmm. The big deal to me is cloud applications do not equal SharePoint hosted, in my opinion. You've got to start thinking of different ways to do that. And SharePoint hosted apps, I think some people would say they have their place for a departmental level app. And I think there's a very fine-grained set of value proposition for that type of app. I think out of the gate, you've got to just start thinking provider-hosted app. In my opinion, you're just going to be better off. Okay. Using your preferred platform, not just Azure, it's no longer, nothing precludes you from using AWS if you've got an AWS infrastructure and you've got applications that you already have out there and you have them running and you want to turn those applications into provider-hosted apps. It's totally doable. You've got to start thinking, can I do this on-prem? Do I want to have a server farm on-prem? Do I want to have IaaS in the cloud? Do I want to have infrastructure that's running my IaaS servers because I want complete control and I don't want a PaaS environment? Mm-hmm. You can do that. Nothing stops you from doing that. And recently in Build and Ignite, that story got a whole lot better as far as using the web proxy and those types of things. And if that's something that you need to do, there's a great article by Kirk Evans recently that he talks about that in depth. And to me, I tweeted out, that's a huge game changer. Being able to have on-premises applications and the cloud kind of, that barrier is so much more reduced right now. It's an easy thing to do, so to speak. So the other is learn cloud and architectural patterns. So if you're going to go down the route of trying to look at how do I implement cloud application model or add-ins, how am I going to talk with services that consume Outlook and an on-prem service or a service that I've got custom written in Azure or in AWS or Heroku for that matter, mm-hmm. You're going to have to learn some different patterns that are cloud specific. How do I deal with taking a dependency on something over the network? Well, if I was on my own network, that was great, right? I pretty much could guarantee the uptime and all that kind of stuff. But now I've got to think about resiliency, timeouts, retries, all sorts of things. So you're going to have to learn a few new patterns and think about how do I deal with those. Number 7 is understanding the client development options. I talked a little bit, just mentioned HTML5 and CSS, but now that I have the ability to kind of write these single-page apps, this is kind of the hot new thing and has been for a little while. What does that mean for your application, though? The old web part, Postbacks and the old ASP.NET page model, you don't have to use that anymore. So if I'm going to consume, services from Office 365, I need to know how do I use things like cookies, local storage, can I use IndexedDB to my advantage? How can I do those things?
HTML is back, baby.
I don't think it ever left. I think it just got a whole lot better in the last couple of years. Knowing frameworks like Backbone or Knockout and what they afford you, I don't want to get into the holy war of which one's better. I think it's a decision based on maturity of a client, what they're willing to take on, how big the app is. Classic consultant answer, it depends, right?
Yeah.
But I think understanding those and knowing what they'll provide you is a big deal. And knowing things like D3 for charting or Moment for date management, time management, Breeze especially for getting in and out of data source and being very mobile friendly. That's a huge one to me.
Is this crippling at all, like trying to decide, like you start off with a new project and you're like, okay, which framework? Well,
everybody
let's spend the first 3 weeks deciding which frameworks. I mean, how do you?
Honestly, I think I think you need to look at developer skill, what the background is, how comfortable are you with the speed of change. If you're going to take a dependency on an open source project like that, how healthy is it? The old saying of, oh, well, it's not even 1.0. People look at that. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to look at how vibrant is the community. I mean, Angular has Google, full-time employees behind it. Breeze is the same way. Some of those libraries, I think you have to look at it, and try to say, well, what does it really buy me? And don't just look at the surface because it's hot, right? Look at, do I need two-way binding? Do I care about having all this extra kind of cruft from Knockout and having observables all over the place? Is it something that your developers can grok really quickly? Can they understand it, and can you communicate? Can they write the code so that they can communicate that to somebody else quickly, right? If the old saying, if code like like the guy who's going to code after you knows where you live, right? And unit testing. I mean, pick a tool that sort of is unit test friendly. I think that is the big thing right now. This is new, and I think SharePoint folks got away from it, me included. I'm not trying to point a finger. It was, I did some of those things too. You kind of had to sometimes. You didn't write some of the unit tests you should in code. You didn't do some of those things. Well, now, you've got the separation. You could prototype the front end really quickly with mock data using Angular and say, is this what you want to customer A? And they say, absolutely, that's what I want. Okay, now it's going to take me X amount of time to wire those things up. But, that to me is invaluable. The customer sees something really quickly with you prototyping. Literally, you could do it right in front of them. So, all the other things there, I think the two biggest things to me is how much Microsoft has made an investment in really kind of providing you the ability to get to the cloud and to their services and to be hybrid, doing things like the ADAL libraries, specifically for the client side, the ADAL.js library. The investments they've made with cross-platform things. I said Yeoman to somebody, I think, 8 months ago. 9 months ago. They were like, yo man, what's up? And I was like, no. You have to look at some of these other technologies. Web developers are now SharePoint developers to me. And other people have said it. I'm not the first to say it by any means. But things like Yeoman, things like generators that kind of lower the bar as far as, hey, SharePoint used to be point and click, and now I can demo something really quickly to a client. Well, now I've got things like Yeoman, I've got things like Run and Gulp, I've got all these different tools that actually let me kind of build those same solutions really quickly and get value really quickly too.
I'm still stuck on that word grok. Let's grok the house.
Let's grok the house. And I'm really excited because I think one of the big things to me, I went to a Mac 2.5 or 3 years ago, kicking and screaming, actually.
Confessions of a Mac
user. I was a lifelong Windows user. I honestly, it scared the what out of me when I went to a Mac. But now, I mean, it was really exciting to see Visual Studio Code come out, some of those types of things. But it doesn't matter where you are now. If you're a Mac user, a Windows user, a Linux user, you now have tools that in your comfortable environment, you can be productive even in an on-premises environment, talking to those services, pulling out those services from, talking to CSON, getting user profile information, writing to lists, provisioning anything. Those are things that you can do, and you're not constrained anymore. So we're almost towards the end, right?
Somebody's going to do a build slide.
So here's a slide that I purposely changed this one to kind of go slower. So defend your business logic and your sanity. I don't know how many times people have said this, but repeat after me. Change is good. Learn to like it, right?
I'm smart enough.
So, okay, yeah, and darn it.
People like me.
So a lot of conversations I'll have with customers are, Microsoft is telling me to get off their server. I spent 10 years learning this server-side object model. Now what am I going to do? The woe is me type thing. I hate JavaScript is probably one of the most common things I've heard. And really, I kind of choose to look at this a really different way and not have that pity party with somebody and try to be sort of thinking, I can do something that I kind of complained about for almost 7 years in the SharePoint environment, which is I can now pull my business logic out completely. I'm not intermingling code. Yeah, you could do it in the old SharePoint environments, but to get a customer to understand the value of doing that and to pay for it was often very challenging. And that is a reality, right? And then being able to take advantage of those ALM or SDLC processes of, hey, I can unit test my code. I have daily builds. I have better check-in control. I have things that I'm not trying to worry about, okay, what artifact am I deploying, et cetera. And I can start to isolate and innovate. And when I say that, I mean I can take that application that I'm writing and instead turn it into a web API. Use the client-side object model. Use client-side technologies like those frameworks, Backbone, Angular, et cetera. Use things to my advantage and kind of do what Microsoft announced recently, and we talk about it in that white paper, which is if I start to be able to loosely couple things and then I have high cohesion in my business processes, I can put those things together in some really unique and innovative ways. And if I have a business process that's very tight, and I can look at that and say, okay, I want to know, in a manufacturing area, where's all my inventory coming from? Say you're doing extruding of plastic bottles, and you need to know all the levels of how much plastic and how much resin, how much dye, all this kind of stuff that you need. That's a very specific business process, right? But if you want to have that wired in with something like, hey, when levels get low, let my purchasing agent know. Now I can look at it and say, oh, I can consume the Office 365 APIs because we're on Office 365 for mail. I could add a task to their environment. I could queue something that says process this. And I could actually surface that information into a client environment, and someone in a web browser could actually see, hey, those more of a dashboard of those levels are low. Somebody needs to take care of this. The other benefit to that is, what if I was in Excel? Now I can be in Excel and I can have that same experience pulled from that web API and actually have somebody that's looking at what was my resin count, use Power BI to actually look at that data and say, how do I integrate this into my business process and actually order earlier, or what was my usage? What did I have happen in that manufacturing plant? So really explore the patterns and practices. The Office PNP team really has done an amazing job. No, I'm not paid to say that. I think what they're doing is a fantastic thing. Commit dev.office.com to your memory. Look at roadmap.office.com. Go through the guidance from the PNP team. Look at the training content. All of the free training that they have in the Virtual Academy area. I would spend a lot of time in there. Using the patterns and approaches that they've laid out to actually transition from full trust code to the cloud application model, or the add-in model as they're calling it now, you have a tremendous advantage today. If you're new to SharePoint, take that as your kind of starting point to say, did PNP do anything with this problem? Did they try to address this problem? Branding, provisioning, site management, you name it, it's out there, right? And use that to your advantage and then understand that. To that point, some things that are really important to understand in that structure, if you go to that GitHub environment, and this was some good feedback internally that I got, which was the Office Dev PnP Core library is really a series of extension components that help you perform all those remote operations. You can do things in PowerShells, CSOM, you can write it in JavaScript, you can do it server-side, but they are really looking at how do they provide you with a core set of functionality that lets you do things that you absolutely have to do remotely, and how do you do them properly without paying that customization tax we talked about earlier. Know the difference between samples, scenarios, and solutions, and you can read it there, but think of samples as I can F5 this really quickly and get some huge value out of this. A scenario is going to take a dependency on that core library, but let you kind of walk through it easier within Visual Studio, kind of look at things of how do I create a little more complex scenario, and then a solution is really something that you could potentially take and utilize yourself. Basically, redeploy that into your own environment, and they're telling you go ahead and do that. The example that I gave before about provisioning OneDrives with some specific branding or those types of things is a great example. And finally, number 10. This I think is probably not on your radar if you were just doing this. But this is one of the big things that I think is an advantage if you're about to start moving full trust code to the cloud application model, or you're thinking about it. Why do you want to do this? And the way of the world right now is pushing you towards defining things and very tight, as I said, very kind of coherent modules, if you will. And I need services that I can use and consume all over the place. If you start to treat, even on-prem, provisioning services and consuming email, or consuming Dell, for example, the search API, the Open Graph API, you start to look at combinations of those things where you can do all sorts of things where you're integrating across a stack, not just on-prem, but in the cloud. Search is a good example. You're now about to have an integrated index between on-prem and the cloud. That's huge to me. But if you don't know how to make calls into that environment, you're not going to be able to call one spot. You're going to have to call the cloud for that.
Yeah.
So, understanding that, being able to call that environment is a huge deal. The SharePoint as a platform, I think, 5, almost 6 years ago, wrote a white paper on SharePoint 2010 as a platform, and that really was kind of the genesis of me calling the new business operating system. We called SharePoint an operating system, the business operating system back then. Originally, it was Bill Gates, but to me, SharePoint has now become, instead of SharePoint as a platform, it's Office as a platform, and you have to look at it as that. And I hope Andrew Connell hears this, because I like it. He's calling it EPAS, right? Enterprise Platform as a Service. And yes, it is working. If he's ever listening, he'll get the joke. If you listen to a podcast, he'll probably understand it too. He probably finds it funny that I'm saying EPAS, but it's true. I mean, really, if you look at it, Office as a platform to consume those services is going to make some really compelling apps in the near future. And yeah, like I said, you're probably not going to get there, but this is something you should be thinking about. And then the unified API is something that I think
I missed a typo, Microsoft in there. We'll edit that when we send it out.
All right. So the link looks wrong on the screen. Yeah, it's probably, no, it's not a shortcut. It's probably wrong. So we'll fix that link in the deck. But the unified API was just announced. So if you're familiar with some of the things from the Office APIs, looking at the graph is really kind of interesting to me, and I think that's where, if you're just getting new to cloud application model, learn the things that are in PnP, and then this is something that you kind of keep an eye towards, right? Because as Microsoft tries to unify, how do I get to my files? How do I get to my information? How do I get to groups of, how do I recognize where I am in my organization. What did Danny publish today? What kind of things was Kirk working on?
Mm-hmm.
As they kind of present those, but then also think of how you could use that information in your own apps. How do I send notifications? How could I possibly use the Skype for Business API and actually do start IM conversations real time on the web, real time from a Word app? How could I pull someone in from a Word app that's actually calling into my service that's a provider-hosted app? And now I'm kind of stepping maybe a year, 2 years ahead for some folks in some organizations. But if you're not thinking that way now, you're probably going to say, oh, well, I shouldn't do that. Well, no, this is a reason you probably want to start thinking, use that provider-hosted app and start looking at that longer term. And this is just a graphic of that unified API that they recently announced, and I think this really speaks to a lot of the things that I mentioned. You're going to have to learn those kind of how can I use the technologies at my disposal, with client-side things, Azure, etc. So take a look at that if you can.
What would you say if you had to narrow it down to one or two things that you want people to take away from the top 10?
From the top 10, really, it's not migration, it's transformation. You really need to think about what is the business problem I'm trying to solve and how can I solve that in a little more future thinking way. The other thing is you really have to look at remote management patterns. And CSOM is your friend, Azure, AWS, I don't care if you're an Azure hater, I'm not. I think they are winning. I think Azure is winning at this point. So understand, how do I deal in that remote world, and what are the architectural patterns I have to have. And probably, if there's one thing you take away from this, go to GitHub, search for Office Dev, and go to the PMP samples. Spend some time in there. That is going to be a huge value to you. So when we send this out, I've got other links in here and links throughout, but especially some of those things for Office, the PMP program. I think that's probably the biggest thing. If you're not going to call ThreeWill, right, I hope you do. I hope I get the opportunity to talk to everybody directly.
Don't you want to come talk to us?
Yeah, don't you want to come talk to me? Don't you want to see me do something rather than listen to me? No, spend some time in there and go to the Yammer group for Office 365 Dev. Post a question in there. Post a question, tweet out you're having problems with something. The community is really trying to get this going because there is a huge benefit to it.
And as Pete mentioned, well, first off, Pete, thank you for taking the time to do this.
Yeah, no problem.
This is really informative. I appreciate you taking that time to do this. And I think it was a great follow-up to your seminar. The next steps from here, I'd love to have you follow us at ThreeWill, and you can also do the same with following Pete at P. Skelly. We have events going on this year. You can go check out our event calendar at threewill.com/events. This webinar, you'll get an email next week from me with a link to this webinar, and also you'll be able to download a PDF of the slides as well. So you'll look for that next week. Probably it'll be later than Monday, since Monday's a day off.
Have a good weekend.
Yes, enjoy the day off on Monday. Finally, if you've got a chance, go check out our latest newsletter. It's a monthly newsletter that goes out. You'll be informed on things like these webinars that we're doing. Lastly, we'd love to have a follow. If you're trying to figure out what you're going to do as an organization to move these full trust code solutions over to the new cloud app model, we would love to have a follow-up conversation with you. Just get on the phone with you and talk more through what you're trying to accomplish, apply some thought towards what you're trying to do. We'd love to have the opportunity to talk to you as a follow-up to this webinar as well. Well, with that, Pete, again, thank you for taking the time to do this. Everybody have a wonderful long weekend. Enjoy your time out. Enjoy some grilled food, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us for this webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.